Does it work, Mike? I think so. Hello, good morning, everybody. It's very nice to be here. I'm Carolina. I'm a PhD student from the Netherlands. I'm doing my PhD partially at the Dutch Med Service, KNMI. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about a new framework that we're introducing in the Netherlands. The title is called From the Web of Low Temperature to a 1 to 10 Heat Force Scale. And just to kick off, I was wondering who of you have ever worked with the web bulk low temperature before? Can you raise your hand if you have? Okay, few of you. Who of you have never heard of the web bulk low temperature? Can you raise your hand? Okay, so maybe you weren't in the movie yesterday because we did get a pretty good introduction there. But I will tell you about it, no worries. In the Netherlands, our heat warning systems are based on maximum temperatures. That has been always the case. So our definition for heat wave based on maximum temperature. We do kind of look at a few other variables, but not really sufficiently. And we know from a physiological perspective that other variables are really important. What we're seeing more and more in the Netherlands, and perhaps also in other countries, are outside of heat wave periods, especially when there are things like a big running event, even when it's not that hot. There was an example where it was 23 degrees. We still see people getting issues, suffering from the heat, also because they are running, of course. But we, as a med service, kind of felt this demand from society for additional information around heat, for information on thermal heat stress. So what did we do? Together with multiple institutions, we did multiple workshops. It was led by TNO, and we have two collaborators here in the room with us as well there, Boris and Marghidan. And yeah, this was kind of the consortium. So TNO focusing on thermophysiology and occupational health, KNMI, the med services perspective. We also had VU, University in Amsterdam, and RIVM, and they are our health authorities. So it was really actually valuable to sit together with these important stakeholders to come to a shared understanding of how can we communicate heat, how can we measure heat in the Netherlands, and agreed on that. So what did we came up with? First, we came up with a two-part framework. The first part is called the heat force scale, which is a 1 to 10 scale based on the web bulk globe temperature. And it's meant to kind of give an indication of the heat stress, environmental heat stress outside. This is operationalized by the Met Service. But that's only one part of the story, right? The same heat might not affect everybody in the same way. So we need another part, which is called how heat fit are you? We have Dutch terms for it, but this is the English translation. And here we can look at multiple characteristics like personal characteristics, but also clothing, activity levels and duration. And together, that basically gives us the opportunity to give more targeted and fit for purpose guidance. So we get a better understanding of heat risk. And so the scale, I will tell you a little bit more about it. It's based on the web bulk globe temperature, which is a measure that integrates temperature, humidity, wind, and solar radiation. You can measure it. Yesterday we saw in the movie they had a measurement device. Basically, it's 10% air temperature, 70% is the wet bulb temperature, which basically simulates the cooling effect of sweating. So when the wind goes by your skin and you sweat, that simulates that effect. And then the third component is the black bulb temperature, which simulates the feeling of the sun. So at the Met Service, we don't yet have direct measurements of the web bulk globe temperature, but we calculate it using a method called Liljegren method. That's a widely used one. We already have this data available openly. And we have a forecast that our meteorologists are getting used to. So they're looking at the forecast and getting used to interpreting it. So how does the web bulk globe temperature behave in the Netherlands? Here you can see a box plot of the past few decades. We have to leave the building? No, I think it's fine. Yeah, here you can really see a very nice seasonal pattern, just like the temperature. You can see, the hottest months are in June, July, August. And generally, it doesn't really cross the 30 degrees that often. This is for one reference point in this kind of center of the Netherlands. So obviously, maybe in the cities or in different locations, it can be higher. But yeah, what we see if we plot the Weber globe temperature across daily maximum temperature, we see that usually the Weber globe temperature is lower than maximum temperature, especially at higher values. So that's a little bit confusing, right? Because it also is expressed in degrees Celsius, the Weber globe temperature. And what we see is that even at the same temperature, the Weber globe temperature can differ almost by 10 degrees in the most extreme cases. And that's, of course, understandable because it depends on other variables. So, but this means that it gives us a lot more information. It gives us extra information than only looking at the temperature. If we look at the top 5% highest Weber globe temperature days and the top 5% days with the highest temperature, we see that they overlap for 70%. So a lot of the days overlap, but that also means that 1 in 3 days do not overlap. So 1 in 3 days with extreme Weber globe temperature are actually not that hot temperature-wise. So, and also the other way around. And that's also because in the Netherlands, humidity and temperature are mildly negatively correlated. So sometimes you have really high temperatures, but the humidity is not that high. So that can be some explanations. And there are also spatial differences. So this is an example of a heat event this summer on the 1st of July. It was really hot. Temperatures almost, 38 in the south of the Netherlands. And you can really see a very different gradient, a very different pattern. If you compare the Weber globe temperature on left, you can see really influence from the sea, probably wind. And then in temperature case, you really just see the south is hotter than the north. So yeah, they give a different picture is my story here. So how do we translate this to a scale? This is a very interesting process. And the idea is that we will communicate it on our app, but also, so for your location, you can just see, oh, the heat force here is 6 today. But we also want to have high resolution maps so you can also see throughout the country what the values are. As I already mentioned, why did we want this scale? Because the Weber globe temperature is difficult to interpret for the public, right? It's kind of a complex and very difficult term to even pronounce. I've said it many times, so I think I got it now, but for new people, it's always like, what? So yeah, a quantitative scale, very intuitive. People can learn how to use it. And in Dutch, it's actually an amazing term. So we call it hittekracht, which has the same kind of, it's the same term as windkracht and zonkracht, which is the UV index and the Beaufort wind force. Maybe you know those scales. But in Dutch, it's the same exact term. So we believe it will be very useful for the public and that it will be on the news every day, what will be the hittekracht tomorrow. So we're excited to see how the public will react. And this is a scalable model that can be adapted basically anywhere. Also, the underlying indices could be adapted. Like we use the Weber globe temperature, but it could be any index that you would want. And we plan to launch this for the public by next summer, so very soon. Some examples here of what it could look like if we implement this. This is a really hot day where you can just see the Weber globe temperature is rising, but instead of communicating, oh, the Weber globe temperature is 28, we can just clearly see, oh, now it's an 8, but the maximum was a 10, which is the highest. This was actually, I think, the hottest day ever recorded. First time 40 degrees in the Netherlands, so 10 is exceptional. You can see that for 1 hour it did get to that point. Yeah, how did we determine the scale is quite interesting, but to summarize it shortly, we first looked at how the Weber globe temperature behaves in the Netherlands. We looked at the percentiles, a bit of what I showed, and then we started showing that internally to our meteorologists and climatologists at KNMI, asking, what do you think of this scale? And they said, well, percentiles, that will be really difficult because you have basically 15.6 and 20.1 and like decimals, right? That's not really easy for them to think of the scale, even when it's automatized. So we came up with 2 alternative scales based on the percentiles, but without the decimals, going up in steps. Then we also talked to, of course, all our partners, TNO, NVM, but everybody was like, well, the two scales look pretty good. It doesn't really matter that, like, they're both good. So we didn't know what to do for many months. We said, which scale should we choose? Eventually we had to roll a dice, I guess, flip a coin. No, we picked one that was the easiest to use, that contains steps of 2 degrees going up. Here you can see it's still a preliminary scale, but this is what we have. So it starts at heat force 1 below 16, and it goes up in steps of 2 degrees until the top, basically. But there are still a few considerations that we want to take into account, that we already took into account when thinking of this. For example, which degrees, which wet bulb below temperature degrees matter for impact or action, because we would like it to be where we go a step up, because then we can tie actions to this scale. Another consideration is how big are differences between rural and urban areas, because if it's really big, then maybe we have to adapt the scale to be more fit for purpose for the cities where most people live. And also, how large is the bias? This is something we still want to investigate as well. Well, our partners from TNO, they also did a very interesting literature study to look at what are some of the critical limits where we see that either cardiovascular limits start to rise or average core temperature starts to rise in older adults, which is the top one, and young adults. So these are just different studies and the wet bulb below temperature range that they provide. And what's really interesting is that you just see a lot of differences between the studies. And you see a range, right? Which also means even if you have a group like older people, there are also differences within that group, obviously. So going back to the scale, it's not that straightforward to be like, oh, at 30 degrees, all old elderly people will start having trouble. Like that's basically too simple of a message. But this already does give us a good idea. So for example, for older adults, we see that the cardiovascular limit was around 29, the average between all these studies and people. And for the core temperature was around 30.5. So that does kind of, that's at the higher end of the scale. A few ongoing things, and I'd really also welcome feedback and questions from you if you have any thoughts or ideas, because we are still working on this. One point that came up was, should we have a heat force level 0? Because basically everything below 16 now is 1. But what if it's freezing? Are we going to say it's heat force 1? Like, people were kind of, worried that that would not be interpreted by the public correctly. Like, oh, it's freezing and there's a heat force. So one alternative would also be to just communicate it in the summer months or extended summer or above a certain temperature. But I'd be happy to hear if you have any ideas or maybe similar frameworks. Also the forecast scale, as I mentioned, the spatial variability. We do have our KNMI stations, obviously, but they're like most Met services stations outside of the city. We also have amateur network from people that have a weather station in their garden or balcony. So we can incorporate that data also to calculate the wet bulb below temperature on a higher resolution scale. And the last one is pretty important, but I won't talk now about it. But if you are interested, I'm happy to chat further, is how are we integrating this into our warning system? Will it be part of the official trigger for looking at heat waves, or is it a completely separate but complementary heat service that we are providing? And what I've heard mainly from meteorologists is wet bulb below temperature is not the best indicator to signal an incoming heat wave, because first of all, temperature is much more predictable at longer timescales, and if you have all this index with other variables, it gets a bit more difficult to predict further in advance. So the meteorologists are kind of leaning towards, well, temperature, we can signal it further in advance, and then we want to use the heat force as a complementary kind of measure to say, is it high or low because of the humidity and so on. But we are afraid that the public will be confused with another measure. So there are many considerations here. I don't think the public will be confused, but it is important to consider the communication aspects. Thank you very much for listening.